Welcome to Exploring A Course in Miracles. I'm Emily Bennington with the Circle of Atonement, here with Circle founder Robert Perry. And today we are thrilled to be joined by someone that I'm excited to meet, but who I know Robert has known for many years, and that is Roger Walsh. Roger has been with the Course from very nearly the beginning of its journey. He is a professor of psychiatry, philosophy, and anthropology, as well as a professor in the religious studies program at the University of California at Irvine. Roger's research includes the nature of psychological health and well-being, meditation, religion, and spirituality. On a personal level, he has long been deeply immersed in contemplative practices as a student, researcher, and teacher. He is also a Tibetan Buddhist Lama and was formerly a circus acrobat. Don't know if we'll have time to discuss that. A world record high diver, and in his own words, a quote, spectacularly unsuccessful stand-up comedian. Roger is the author of a number of books, including Paths Beyond Ego, The World of Shamanism, and Essential Spirituality, the Seven Central Practices. He and his late wife, Frances Fawn, published 3 books of selected passages from A Course in Miracles: Accept This Gift, A Gift of Peace, and A Gift of Healing. They were eventually published together as gifts from A Course in Miracles. And Roger has a podcast, which he hosts with John Dupuy. It's called Deep Transformation, and it offers dialogues with cutting-edge thinkers, artists, contemplatives, and activists. Roger, we are so thrilled to have you on the show today. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you so much. What a gift to be able to dialogue with you about the Course.
Yeah, it's our favorite topic. So just to get started here, can you tell us a bit about your own journey with the Course? How did you first discover it? What has been your process with it? And what is your relationship with the Course now?
Sure. Well, like so many people, and as the Course intended, I was introduced to it in a relationship, specifically with a relationship with my to-be wife, Frances Fawn. And at the time, I was a psychiatrist. I had gotten over some of my scientific reductionism and had opened to practices like meditation and contemplation and yoga and so forth, and actually done my journey to the East, spent some time in Burma and monastery doing intensive Vipassana practice. So I was fairly immersed in Eastern contemplative practices. And then at a certain stage, when I met Frances, she showed me the very original, almost manuscript form of A Course in Miracles. And I opened it up, saw the words God, Holy Spirit, said, no thanks, closed the book, and would have happily forgotten about it, except I kept running into people in Frances' circle who were saying, well, we're really impressive people, and said really interesting things. And I say, that's interesting. Where'd you get that? And they'd say, A Course in Miracles. And finally, I went to an American Psychiatric Association meeting where Jerry Jampolsky and Bill Thetford, one of the co-scribes of the Course, were giving a presentation on it. And I don't understand this, but I remember listening to Bill Thetford. And at a certain stage, this thought arose, okay, if this guy's interested in it, I'm going to look at it. And so I did. And it took me about a month to get through my aversion to the Christian language. I was inoculated against Christianity in Sunday school. But once I got through my aversion to, or my conditioned aversion to the Christian symbolism and language, I began to appreciate its profundity and see that below the specifically Christian terms and concepts and narrative were essential elements from the world's great traditions, the so-called perennial wisdom that underlies each of these traditions. And I began to appreciate that it really has an enormous profundity. So in my typical obsessive way, from going from, and like a new convert, I dived in and spent an enormous amount of time studying. At one stage, I just set aside weeks and just immersed myself full time in it. And the more I went into it, the more I began to appreciate the extraordinary profundity of this material. And of course, I was very fortunate in that Francis was doing it also very deeply. And as you know, the course is wonderful in its emphasis on relationship. In fact, one of the unique features of the course as compared to any other tradition in the world is that its central focus is on peer relationship. There are traditions such as Hindu yoga, in which the emphasis is on a guru yoga, for example, or Jewish, the tzaddik, the teacher. The idea of relating to and devotion to a teacher is central to practically every one of the great traditions. But the idea of peer relationship is the central focus. I have found that nowhere else in any other tradition. So it was beautiful to be doing it in intimate relationship, as you well know. And so that became a context and a central practice, our relationship and then relationship in general. And the deeper I went into it, the more I found several just remarkable things. One was its psychological sophistication, even to the point where I teach psychiatry, and I would drop course ideas into my teaching, but was carefully disguised so as not to give the source away. and I also found that, as with any really profound text, each time you go through it, it unveils deeper levels of meaning and significance. And kind of like the experience is, where was I last time I read this? Why didn't I see this before? So, and over time, I began to see the commonalities with other traditions, and I could really appreciate both the universality of the course's message, as it says, but also its distinctiveness and its unique features and practices and contributions. So it's been a wonderful gift. It still remains part of my life. After 40 years, there's almost been no day when I haven't done it as a practice each and every day. It's still a central part. I begin my day with it. I often practice as the very first thought of the morning. I give my life to God to guide today, which is the title of one of the lessons. So it's just become part of my life, part of my thought, and I hope it'll become an ever deeper part of my life and my thought.
Mm. I love what you just
Right.
shared about the course's focus on relationships, because that was one of the original things that drew me to this path as well. It really is unique in that regard. And finding
Indeed.
God by seeing him in other people is just an incredible idea that has the potential to heal so much of the friction in our world.
Beautifully
Yeah.
said. Yes.
Now, I like the practice focus that you just shared about, because the workbook has been, of the 3 volumes, I think, my main focus. And there's so much power in that practice, and yet, we're a discipline-averse culture. It's easy to sort of sidestep that element.
Well, yes. Of course, like any practice, it requires some effort, although the course is exquisitely seductive. It starts, as you well know, with just a minute a day, and then gradually ask you to do a little more and a little more until you realize it's planning on taking over your life. But by that stage, you're very happy to surrender your life to it. So, and it becomes very clear that that mind knows a hell of a lot more than this mind, also knows a hell of a lot more about what really works in life. So it becomes not a sacrifice, but a willing, grateful offering of oneself, one's worldview, one's understanding into a larger mind and understanding.
Yeah. Well, I know that you knew Bill Thetford, and he was not only the co-scribe, of course, but our appreciation of Bill's approach to the course has really grown over time. We feel that in a lot of ways, he really got what it means to walk this path in practice. We had come across a journal he wrote in 1966, some time ago, which was so much like what we've been teaching in terms of the walking in the path that it was amazing. Anyway, I just wanted to ask what your relationship was with him, and do you have any memorable stories about him in regard to the practice of the course?
Yeah, well, I was very fortunate to have a long-term friendship with Bill, again through Francis. And I should mention, I also was fortunate through him to meet Helen. There was only a one evening introduction, but I was grateful to have that opportunity too. And of course, I should add that I approached the course with my typical scientific skepticism and the like, okay, what is this? Prove it to me. Who are these people? So I'm very grateful to have actually been able to meet these people, and I have no question about the authenticity either of them or of their story about the origins of the course. So that was very helpful to me in my skeptical mind. Bill was just a wonderful human being, but utterly unassuming. And like you, my appreciation of him grew over time. In fact, the first time I ever got to spend any significant time with him, he came over to have dinner with Francis and me. And he was so unassuming. I remember the thought going through my mind, this guy needs some assertiveness training. Well, I was not, it was not a terrible, humble perspective on my part. And I realized that I was a little presumptuous over time as I began to appreciate his very unassuming ways. But also there was a certain almost unassuming to the point of a fault side to him, but in a very wonderful way. And like you, I really came to appreciate his understanding of and relationship to the course and his extremely non-dogmatic approach to it. And I love the story of the time he was called up by a couple of people having an argument about the course. And he said, oh, yeah, what page is that on? And they said, oh, such and such a page. He said, yeah, tear it out. And I just thought that was wonderful. So many of the world's problems would be solved if other teachers would say, tear out that page you're arguing over. So he was a wonderful soul. He wrestled with his role. He certainly didn't want to be seen as a spokesperson for the course, and he assiduously avoided that role and in almost every way. He was smart and insightful and capable, but he really wanted to be in the background. And I think the course owes a lot to the fact that he and Helen did want those background roles, did not put themselves out in any way as either role models or teachers of the course. And I think they knew well that the course can and needed to stand on its own, and it does, of course, completely. It's astounding that one can have just in 3 volumes a self-contained and full path laid out, both a worldview and understanding that text lays out, and a basic framework for the understanding of the nature of reality, and a very practical path for opening and eventually awakening to and realizing that reality. So like you, I just have enormous respect for Bill and the role he played and the priceless gift he and Helen gave us. And Bill was, Helen was a troubled soul in a number of ways. Bill was he was human. He had his concerns and issues, but he also had a humility and an authenticity which was just enormously touching. He also had some gifts. I came as a kind of scientific type. I came with enormous suspicion of anything psychic, yet I just heard so many stories about things Bill would do, like deciding he'd really like to see this opera, but it was sold out, but just his voice saying, oh no, just go and stand this corner of the outside the theater. And sure enough, there's someone be offering sell a ticket. It's like, you hear enough of those stories, you go, well, maybe. So I count as one of my life's privileges to have known him.
That's great.
I wish I would have had the opportunity to meet Bill. Robert, I know you had an occasion to meet with him as well. I don't know
Yeah,
if you
but
want to share anything that you remember from that time that you were able to be
I
with him.
mean, I wish I had spent more time with him. I think that, you know, I was in California, he was in California, we all assumed he'd be around for a while.
Yeah, he passed
So
away pretty young. He was 65.
I think 65.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe 65. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, the time that I spent around him, he was just what everyone says about Bill. He was mirthful and lighthearted and unassuming.
Yeah. Well, Roger, the what you've just shared about Bill, particularly in relation to how he had some kind of connection and he was able to go to the theater, for example, and just have a sense that he would get tickets and he would. And I know Carol Howe has many stories similar to that in her book, Never Forget to Laugh, about Bill, who she knew very well as well. And this brings up a question that Robert and I had. We have been very impressed by the ways in which Bill actively sought to practice the course, to study it each day and to actually practice it in his life. And so I'm curious as to if you know anything about how he sought guidance, whether he sought guidance, um, which feels different than just hearing something and having it, like actively seeking guidance. Should I go this way or should I go that way? Should I make this decision, that decision? And I'm wondering if you know anything about Bill's relationship with guidance, and I'd be curious as to your own relationship with guidance because it is such a core part of course practice.
Well, having spent a lot of mornings with Bill in which Francis and Jerry Jampolsky and Judith Scutch and Bill and I would get together and study the course, I witnessed him on numerous occasions just closing his eyes, going inside and asking for guidance. And so I think that was just a very familiar practice for him and something he did regularly. I don't know if there were any other ways he opened to and sought that, but I certainly saw that that was something he did. In fact, that was how I got into the course. I was invited into that course group. I was invited in for a one-time visit. At the end, Bill just closed his eyes for a few minutes and said, "I think you should continue coming." So it's like, okay, fine. Thank you. So I know that he did. I don't know much more than that. At least I don't recall much more than that at the moment. As for myself, the process and quote success of inner guidance has been a kind of ongoing question for me. Initially, I would just ask and get either a felt sense or more often some words in the mind that felt with varying degrees that they could definitely be from some transcendent source. That continued for a number of years, and then, curiously enough, about 20 years after about 15 years or so, maybe 20 years ago, I was going through some turmoil, and then that guidance disappeared. And I asked, and nothing would happen. I asked, nothing would happen, and it hasn't been available so much or so regularly since, in terms of just asking, getting a clear question. Often I just get a spacious, quiet, relatively quiet mind, but no particular answer. But there are occasions when out of the blue, something really strong will come through. And the most recent was 6 months ago when I was renting the apartment I'm currently in, and it was going up for sale, and I was wondering whether I should buy it and put myself in hock for the rest of my life and beyond. And I asked, and the response came through thunderously: "Do it." It's like, okay, are you sure? Do it. Okay. And I've been very happy, but those are uncommon these days. So I don't understand it, but there are felt senses, but I've spent 40 years doing fairly intense meditation practice, so I definitely feel attuned to, subtle sense of what's called for in situations. But it doesn't necessarily in any way feel like necessarily a guidance from a transcendent source. So it's kind of a question mark for me.
Yeah, I mean, asking is a really important part of my life. But I'm the first to say that sometimes I get nothing. Most of the time, it's a sense. There are certain times where it's really specific and like psychically so, like things that I don't know, but then come to pass. And in all of it, I can't tell you exactly where it's coming from. I mean, how would I really know? I ask Jesus, I ask God. At the same time, what does come is just wiser than my normal thought process. So like, why wouldn't I call upon that? Even if at times it's wrong, even if I don't know where it's coming from, it just is better information than my own self-generated decisions.
That's a beautiful response. Yeah. And maybe there's a trap that I fall into, expecting bells and whistles and symbols, etc. And maybe, it is that still quiet voice. But Emily, do you have
Yeah,
I'd love to hear what you'd add.
My relationship with the course actually started with guidance. Guidance was not anything that I was all that familiar with. I grew up Christian and was Christian until I found the course. Sunday school didn't quite get me as it got you. I remained a Christian until I discovered the course. But around 2011, I heard this booming voice in my head that said, "Teach." And that voice was accompanied by a purple light. I didn't know what it meant until I
I'm
found
sorry, I
the
didn't
course.
get that. Purple.
A purple light. It was a pulsing purple light and a loud, thunderous, booming voice that just said one word, and it was
But
teach.
You kept hearing it, right?
I kept hearing it, and it wouldn't go away until I agreed to devote myself and my career to the course, which is how I washed ashore at the Circle. But from there, what guidance I tend to get, I will ask, and sometimes I'll hear nothing. Oftentimes I'll hear nothing. I will also ask and get one sentence or a couple of words that I can string together. And then lately, though, and this feels like an evolution in guidance, and I'm convinced that it just comes from asking and asking and asking. Jesus says in the course to claim your right to guidance. And so I've been trying to do that, claiming the right that's there for all of us without exception. And so I've been getting more senses of pictures and complete pictures that come with a whole narrative about what to do, that to me is legitimized because it takes everyone's best interest into account, not just my own.
Beautiful.
And so that's how I know that there's something real in it. But guidance, part of the reason why I wanted to ask you that question is because guidance has been an evolving thing for me. And so I don't hear much about it in other traditions. But I'm just curious as to your relationship with it, given that you've been a course student for so long.
I think that's a very important thing you said, that it evolves, it can evolve, and also that it's like so many other things, it's probably a practice or a skill that one develops and matures, or is developed and matured for one, which is very helpful, because I think there's such a tendency to assume that, oh, well, you should just be able to ask and get something clear. The course does, I think, in many ways, and maybe part of its skillful teaching, it tends to emphasize, overemphasize, I think, the ease of certain practices it calls us to do, and without, implying that, without making clear that these are profound practices that are being asked for.
Yeah, there's what, Robert, which lesson is it that promises an experience of revelation?
Oh, 157, into his presence
Right.
when I enter now. Like you're going to go all the way and go into complete transcendental knowledge.
Right, like that's
on this
the
lesson.
easiest thing to do. Yeah, but we've had instances of guidance where, you know, I know it's part of the Foundation for Inner Peace practice to seek guidance, and as a group we do that here at the circle as well. Sometimes we'll get absolutely nothing, which, you know, is fair enough, but sometimes everyone will get the same thing. And that's always really powerful and beautiful for us when it happens. And so we're big fans of guidance around here. We try and run our lives and the organization on the back of it.
Beautiful.
Oh, we could keep talking about guidance. But to move on, now looking at your writings about the Course, Roger, it seems like a lot of your focus has been on the Course as a voice of the perennial wisdom, and how it contains a lot of the central and essential practices that are common to the world's great spiritual traditions. In Essential Spirituality, your book, you list 7 core practices found in the world's traditions. So I'd like to hear you talk about those 7 core practices, and I know it's a lot to draw out something from the Course on each one, but if there are any of them that you feel that you want to comment on in terms of how that shows up in the Course, that'd be great.
Sure. Well, one can look at the commonalities of various traditions in various ways, and tradition, one of the most ancient is the yogic distillation of practices into 4 categories: the Jnana Yoga, which is the use of the mind, the intellect for discernment; the Bhakti Yoga, which is the yoga of love and devotion; the Raja Yoga, which is the practice of meditation; and then the Karma Yoga, which is work and action and service in the world. And clearly the Course contains all. I mean, one of the beautiful things about the Course is it really draws on a wide variety of approaches and practices. And we can get into that, and we can perhaps at some stage get into how we could look at the Course in terms of contemporary psychology. But when I've always been intrigued, and you know, is living in San Francisco and living in London as you do, we are in an incredibly rare situation, because this is one of the very few times in human history where we have access to all the world's religious and spiritual traditions. Think of a time when that was last available. The closest I've been able to come up with is Alexandria 2,000 years ago. So it's a very rare thing to have all the world's traditions available. And I've just been fascinated to ask the question, well, what are the greatest minds and souls that have ever landed on this planet said are the most important qualities of heart and mind to cultivate if you want to really become a full human being and live and life to the full and contribute as well and as helpfully as possible, etc. And if we can identify those qualities, how do they say you develop them? Well, so I spent several years, actually 3 years, studying and researching this book you mentioned, Essential Spirituality, the 7 Central Practices. And of course, a lot of years before then, studying too. But what I found was one could really identify 7 common practices and qualities of heart, mind that all the traditions, great traditions, agreed on. First, they agreed that one really needed a foundation in ethics. That is, you just couldn't wake up or heal or live fully and well if you were harming and hurting people, including yourself. So ethics is really foundational. Second, emotional transformation. They all imply, and more than imply, they strongly recommend that we transform our emotions to reduce destructive, painful emotions like anger and fear and jealousy, and to cultivate positive ones like love and compassion and joy. Then they acknowledge that the mind, our usual mind state is very uncontrolled and wild and erratic. And we really need to be able to train our attention, to be able to hold awareness on whatever we want to hold it on. And without that capacity for concentration, we're just slaves of our minds. Then they talk about refining perception, seeing things clearly, less tinged by our destructive emotions, egocentric needs, etc. Then they talk about the cultivation of wisdom, that one really needs to understand oneself. A couple of things mainly: one's own being, particularly the nature and way the mind works, but secondly also the central existential issues of life, the issues such as how to deal with meaning and purpose and mortality and relationship and aloneness and those kind of things that all of us confront simply by virtue of being human. And finally, they culminate in service, contribution to others, both as a practice and as the culmination and expression of spiritual life, because we can't practice for ourselves alone, because if we do, we're just reinforcing our egocentricity. But if we practice for the welfare and awakening of all, then that very intention undermines egocentricity, cultivates qualities like generosity and love and compassion, and finally flowers into a life of selfless service. But selfless service recognized not as a sacrifice, as our culture usually understands it, but rather as enlightened self-interest. So each of the traditions has those practices, and I think I may have left one out, but I can't remember if I did.
No, you got them all. You got them all.
Good, thank you. And of course, we find them all in the Course. You can think of the text as a training in wisdom and about the nature of life and reality, both this physical reality, mental reality, and the transcendental domain. And so it gives us a big picture understanding and an appreciation of what really matters in life and what a life well lived really looks like. So it gives us enormous amounts of wisdom. Of course, it's very powerful. And first off, it has this ethics is so central to the Course that I can't think of it's even mentioned as a term. I don't think it is. Maybe you can correct me.
I think once, but it's a list of conventional laws and ethics and so on, but not in terms of Course ethics.
Right. Yeah, I think it's just so central that it's more like the air with which we breathe. But emotional transformation, clearly the Course it's not big on anger. And its treatment of forgiveness is the most sophisticated I've seen in any tradition whatsoever. If you look at motivation springs from as soon as we enter into the ordinary mind and its conceptual thinking, we see dichotomously, or we perceive dichotomously, and we split the world into desirable and undesirable, out of which spring craving for the desirable, aversion towards the undesirable. Craving and aversion, or greed and hatred, are twin-born and interdependent, and you can't have one without the other. Most traditions focus on the craving side. For example, in Buddhism, the first noble truth, there's suffering in life. Second noble truth, the cause of suffering is craving. And third noble truth, okay, end of craving is the end of suffering. Fourth noble truth, here's how you do it. The Course is not unique, but much rarer among the great traditions in having its primary focus on the aversion or hatred side and reducing that. And again, for that, a central practice, as you know very well, is forgiveness. And I have just found nothing which compares to the Course's sophistication and understanding of forgiveness or its practical teachings in it anywhere in any other tradition. So I think that's a unique contribution of the Course. attentional training, concentration, lots of exercises there. Of course, talks about, how untrained our minds are and the need to, what is it? I'm forgetting the line, peaceful mind. No, sorry.
Tranquil mind is
Tranquil
not a little.
mind. Yes. Thank you. You got it. What was the line again?
A tranquil mind is not a little gift.
Yes, beautiful. That's it. Thank you. So much profundity in such a simple statement. So it has that perceptual refinement. Of course, it teaches us how to see each other with holy perception, holy vision. What the Tibetans would call pure perception. It's service. I mean, my goodness, the course is, everything in the course is geared towards awakening. It is a bodhisattvic path. The bodhisattva is the Buddhist ideal of devoting one's life to the welfare and awakening of all. And the course is a bodhisattvic path, and it clearly states that none of us get out of this unless all of us get out of it. So it's very clear in that way. So the course contains all these elements, and it adds its unique emphases and its unique contributions in bringing novel practice and ideas such as particularly forgiveness. So that was a long answer, but maybe you'd like to add something.
Yeah, well, speaking of unique contributions, I think that what you have done with your work of taking the world's great spiritual traditions and distilling the wisdom that appears in all of them in such a clear way is an incredible contribution to the world. I've often, and I know I'm not alone in this, wondered what it is if you were to take that wisdom that spans across all of these traditions. What would they all have in common? And you've done that work for us, and so I'm greatly appreciative, and I know I speak for many when I say that. You may have already answered this question.
I wanted to tag on to his previous answer.
Sure.
Before we go off.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I have to say I love that list of 7 core practices. As I was, I had read your book back in the day, but as I was reviewing them today, I thought, gosh, each one of those is so important. And what it also brings up for me is that it's not a simple one-dimensional thing to transform a mind, right? I mean, it's not like do that one thing. Our spiritual culture is very much like our consumer culture. We want something very simple, very easy, and you just do it. And that's it. But when you list those 7 things and think about how essential each one of those things is, I think it reinforces the idea that this goal of spiritual development, psychological development, spiritual awakening, it is a multifaceted kind of goal. And we reduce it to something simplistic, I think, at our peril. So I would love to talk about every one of those 7 things in relation to the course or in themselves. I loved the focus on seeing with sacred vision. And you had mentioned, it might have been your preface to my book, Path of Light. You had mentioned all these parallels. Like you just mentioned pure perception from Tibetan Buddhism, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned other parallels in the writing that I was reviewing. And I've gotten really into the whole issue of vision in the course and how I think it's a really close analog for Walter Stace's extrovertive mysticism as opposed to the introvertive mysticism. But what I haven't done is look at those analogs in other traditions, which would be a very interesting thing. But anyway, I just think that that's a golden list, and I appreciate you, laying it out for us and affirming it. That the fact that the course is sunk into every one of those 7 things, which is very interesting.
It's so remarkable that in 3 volumes, you really have a complete path.
Yeah.
That's pretty astounding.
Yeah.
Oh, it is. Yeah. I mean, what we do at the Circle is we're constantly doing classes and workshops, and every time, every week, we are doing some new topic that our audience probably hasn't heard us speak to. And I'm doing a study on the topic before the class or the workshop. And it is amazing how many things you think, well, aren't really addressed in the course, but there's, 10, 30, 50 references, and a whole tapestry emerges with a perspective that is unique, but, also has tendrils reaching out into other places. So it is amazing how much territory is covered in the course.
It is, and it's done in a way which kind of defies linear analysis. I remember back in my earlier naive days, as if I'm not naive now, but I remember I was going to write a book on the course and basically summarize it. I just spent time studying it, and it's like, you cannot just, the course is done almost like a symphony, as Bill Thetford used to say, with these multiple strands and tones and rhythms, and it's somehow so interwoven in multiple ways that it's very hard to distill out particular. To oversimplify it. It's hard to oversimplify it.
It's hard, yeah.
Yeah, we've learned the same lesson that and I've learned this from Robert. Like, if you're going to teach the course, it's best to narrow it down to one particular topic or one particular section. Stay in the fence of that topic or section, and then just go deep within that. Because if you try and go broad, if you try and teach, what does the course have to say about forgiveness, for example, you can do it, but you're going to have to do it over a series of weeks. Otherwise, there's no way you're going to be able to pack in all that the course has to teach in an hour or something to that effect.
Yeah, and one more little thing before we go on. One of the things that I've done in the past is try to figure out how many themes are dealt with in, say, a single text section. And so a few times I've tried to measure that. And once I gave a class an assignment to measure it themselves based on words that repeat or synonyms. So if you have, at least 2 or 3 mentions of a certain word or words that are close synonyms, how many themes based on that way of counting would you find in a given section? And I consistently come up with about 50 per section.
Wow.
Isn't that astounding? I didn't believe Robert when he said that the first time. And so we went into a section and highlighted the themes, and lo and behold, there were dozens.
And it's amazing. And they're all getting their own little treatments, some of them major treatments. And all those treatments are interweaving with each other. And in the end, what you get is a huge volume of teaching conveyed within what might be 6 or 8 paragraphs.
Yeah, you're making me think of the course as almost holographic, that each paragraph, it combines or embraces numerous other parts and ideas and resonates back with things. So yeah, it is certainly a lot more sophisticated than this little mind. And I got clear a long time ago that if I had a choice between having this mind and that mind, I'd rather have that one.
Yeah.
No
One
kidding.
of the things that we always are amazed by is there'll be a topic, for example, that Robert will do a study on, and by study I mean he'll trace that topic all through the whole course and put together the patterns, and you'll see that the way Jesus treats that topic in the first time it's mentioned and the last time it's mentioned are exactly the same. And for a 2,000-page book, if it were a human mind, there's going to be some kind of irregularity somewhere along the way. And with the course, it's just, I would use the word perfect. It's amazing and then to put all of that consistency of thought in iambic pentameter as well. It's just, it's amazing to us.
Well,
it's wisdom.
and a lot of those, sorry,
Go ahead. No.
A lot of those mentions of, that she's talking about like we just did a workshop on, you mentioned anger. We did a workshop on anger earlier this year. And a lot of the references to anger are not sentences that you would say were about anger. Anger was just showed up as a brief little word in a sentence largely about other things. But what you find is that every time it shows up, if you look at its context, you realize so much of the whole anger thought system is present in that brief little mention, which I just find it's another way of talking about what you were saying, that mind is bigger than mine.
Oh, yeah, there's the understatement of the day.
And it's unique teaching. So with anger, for example, where have you ever heard that anger is never justified? And so
there's got to be some, like we were looking at the Stoics, but these days anger is more,
so we've been
more positively framed.
We've been talking so much about how wisdom tends to evolve from what came before. Incrementally over time, it gets greater. And the course just kind of doesn't adhere to that pattern. It just came in out of the blue with its own unique thought system. And that sort of leads me to the next question here, which is that you may have already touched on this and what you've said about the course's take on forgiveness being a unique contribution to world spirituality and its emphasis on relationships, not just relationship guru to student, but peer-to-peer relationships. And I'm wondering if in your research of all forms of different spiritual traditions, if you can see any other unique contribution that the course makes.
Well, let's see. One, I think, is, as we have mentioned, the fact that it does offer this both a comprehensive thought system and a comprehensive path within these, less than 2,000 pages. And think of every other tradition. It's, there are thousands and thousands or hundreds of thousands of texts over a year, over this millennium. Now, yes, there are source texts, particularly in the Western monotheisms, but those, there's a lot that has had to be added. Now, it's not that the course can't be added to, but it is amazing, as each of us has implied here, in being such a complete thought system and path. So that's one thing that stands out. I think another that's not necessarily unique, but it's certainly stronger than I can think of elsewhere, is its skillful combining of all the traditional paths, going back to, say, the yoga division of the heart, the mind, action, and meditation. All those beautifully woven together in a very exquisite way. I think also there's a uniqueness in its approach as a text. I would have sometimes described the course as the world's most sophisticated cognitive psychotherapy. That is, its primary approach is through concepts, through text. Now, it points obviously far beyond concepts, but it is laid out as a teaching system, as it very clearly says. So the fact that it works with, as it says quite explicitly, I'm gonna give my take on this, but says, your thought system is obnoxious and crazy. It creates a lot of suffering. Here's a thought system which is sane and will bring joy and wake you up. It's not reality, but it's so close that the shift between two reality can be automatic and easy. So it's very clearly its central theme is a transformation of thought system and belief system. Now, all traditions necessarily involve a shift in belief system. Buddhist right understanding, the Neo-Confucian, worldview, et cetera, but its emphasis on offering that as a very effective cognitive therapy, I think is that strikes me as unique. I'd love to know if you think of other things that are unique to the course.
Well, you're speaking Robert's language with the idea of concepts, because while so much of spirituality is seeking to go beyond concepts, the course does use them in its teachings, and we are big fans of that. Robert, do you want to say anything about what Roger has just shared?
Well, I agree with everything you said. I really like how your experience, your study, and your personal practice of the great traditions, I feel like that sensitized you to elements in the course that can easily be overlooked. So that when you read the course talk about the ethical dimension or the meditation dimension, you think, oh, well, I recognize what it's saying here. It has parallels. In terms of what's unique to the course, I think every path has, many unique elements, or they would literally be all the same. I personally feel like everything the course touches, it does so from a unique standpoint, while at the same time, there being kind of tapping into currents that are universal as well. But there was something else I was going to say about what you just said, and I can't think of what it was. I do like the cognitive behavioral therapy dimension. Oh, I know what I was going to say. And that is that I think that, I especially when I was younger, I was involved in lots and lots and lots of different teachings. I felt like it was very improper to have a path. I eventually decided the course was my path, whether I liked it or not. I wasn't crazy about that fact, but it was clear that it had been assigned to me. But a lot of the teachings I read, they gave me teachings that weren't necessarily that transformative of the meaning I assigned to the world. I used to be into teachings about Atlantis. How does believing in Atlantis, or believing there was no Atlantis, how does that change how you see other people? I don't think it does at all. And so I recognize that, as you're saying it, the course is extremely conceptual, extremely verbal. It's nothing but a long string of words. At the same time, it's really like solely concerned with concepts that when you make them part of your belief system, if you sincerely do so, that results in you assigning different meaning to people, to things that happen in your life, to the situations you're in. And that different meaning means different emotions about them. So I think the concepts are there, yes, but with that very practical intent.
Yeah, I think that's beautifully said. The course is a practical course. It is a teaching about transformation. And I think you're pointing to the fact that a lot of so-called spiritual teachings, as far as I can see, don't necessarily transform. I think of the Urantia material, this huge text of a couple of thousand pages, extraordinarily complex cosmology and world systems. And it's like, well, yeah, but so what? How is this going to help me wake up? I just don't see it. Now, maybe I'm missing something, but I tried and I didn't get it. So there's that it's easy to fall in if one becomes interested in unusual, if one has an open mind. Then the question is, well, what kind of explorations really help? And the Buddha was famous for refusing to answer certain questions. He would just say, this question does not lead to edification, quotes. It does not lead to the end of suffering. End of answer. So, and I think, there are a lot of teachings out there which, descriptions of realms and possibilities. Are they true? I don't know, but are they transformative? Not as far as I can see. And the course is a very practical teaching. Yeah. And I just want to say that I really appreciate what you've been doing with drawing out the themes and dimensions of the course in a very practical way and making them accessible. And that your deep study over many years has allowed you to distill essential ideas and themes and practices from the course that just are enormous benefit to us all. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay, my next question is, how do you relate to the Christian dimension of the course? I've read you often describe the course as the perennial wisdom expressed in Christian language. So my question is, do you see that Christian aspect of the course as just kind of an outer shell for some different interior? Or do you see that Christian aspect as reflecting something essential to the course, or maybe somewhere in between the just a shell and something essential?
Well, I think all of the above. That Bill used to call the course the Christian Vedanta. That was the way one of the ways he framed it. And so it seems, as best I can understand, and let's face it, we're dealing with a mind which I'm willing to bet, I'm not willing to bet on much, but I'm willing to bet that mind is outside space-time, is totally beyond any limits, etc. So this little mind's take on what that mind is up to and what it's doing is going to be very limited. But I'm willing to, I assume that the course comes as a very skillful package, as it said, or as the voice said when Bill and Helen asked, why this? And the implication, the message they got was, paraphrasing, was because this will make the universal message available to some people, otherwise in a form which people will be able to hear, or otherwise wouldn't be able to hear the message. So the universality, I think, is part of that, because if there is a fundamental existential dilemma that we all deal with, then presumably the teachings for how to best to respond to that will have certain common core themes. But none of them, each of them also has its own unique offering, and each of them is tailored in a particular distinct ways, what's sometimes called their logos. Each teaching has its logos, the kind of central essence or theme. And so the Christian form of the course seems like something which is very skillfully packaged, or let me frame that, is packaged in a way which will appeal to Western people with an openness to the Christian perspective. And in some ways it feels like, well, is it a shell? No, it feels like an essential part of a skillful teaching approach. So I guess I come back to all of the above.
I remember a lot of years ago, you said to me that it would be like the study of a lifetime, or study of many scholars over many years, to figure out how the course relates to the world's great traditions. And where I've come down with the course in Christianity has been very different over the years. And right now, one of the things we're realizing is you have millions of people flooding out of the Christian church, in part in the US because of what they're seeing with the evangelical movement. People are turned off. And in a way, I mean, Western civilization, they kind of represent Western civilization, which had been Christian for many, many centuries and has been moving out of that for many centuries now. But, our civilization is sunk in the Christian story. And as we slowly outgrow at least many dimensions of that story, I feel like the course is kind of there waiting for us.
Yes, interestingly said, and I think it's very helpful to put what's happening with Christianity and religion in general in, say, particularly the Western world, but also in South America, Africa, in developmental terms. Because let me back up and say that first, it's really crucial to recognize that there are two radically different kinds of religion. There's conventional religion, which centers on a narrative. If you believe the narrative, you're saved. If you don't believe the narrative, you're damned. And it is a conventional narrative-based belief and faith-based. On the other hand, you have, not as well known, a different kind of religion, which was traditionally the contemplative wing or hidden or mystical dimension of religion, which focuses on a psycho-spiritual transformational technology, a way of transforming heart and mind so as to cultivate the same states of consciousness, insights, qualities, capacities, and virtues that the founders realized. Those are radically different. What is happening in the West now is that, and these to some extent represent different psychological stages of maturation. They reflect a conventional stage and a post-conventional or even trans-conventional stage or openness. What is happening now is we are witnessing a cultural evolution within the West, in which you have three main levels of psychological development represented. You have the traditional worldview and belief system and way of thinking, which is most dramatically represented by the fundamentalists. You believe this text literally. Then you have the modern component of world, which is more centered on rationality, analysis, empirical testing, science. Then you have a post-conventional worldview, contingent, cultural subset, etc., which is beginning to step back and question thought systems and givens and cultural mores, etc., not to take them on as given, but to really question and look at the specificity of and validity of some of these claims. So those are three distinct worldviews, and we can see the way the postmodern has emerged and come to strength over the last few decades. There's also a small contingent of so-called integral or metamodern worldview that's emerging. But once you understand, I'll put it radically, I don't think you can understand religion unless you know about adult psychological development. Because without knowing that, you cannot appreciate the way that traditional religion and its religious institutions speak from a conventional, traditional worldview and center of gravity. And as people mature out of that stage, they naturally begin to question that mythic worldview and feel that, oh, this doesn't work for me. This doesn't make sense. It doesn't hold up. And the tragedy is that for the most part, our Western culture only knows the mythic level of reality. It doesn't recognize post-conventional, trans-conventional, mystical forms. And so when people recognize that the mythic understandings and level of thinking no longer work for them, they think they've lost their religion. And in point of fact, if only we could get out into the culture, the recognition that this isn't necessarily a loss of religion, this is maturing into the potential for a further, more encompassing, more embracing, more sophisticated understanding and approach to and practice of religion.
Yeah.
That would just change things so much.
One thing that you said recently in a conversation that you had with Dr. Bob Rosenthal was, this, I'm paraphrasing here, it was, you said that you were riding on the top 6 inches of a wave in an ocean that you didn't know existed. And I love that idea that those of us who have been in conventional religion are doing the same thing. I think we're riding the top wave, 6 inches of a wave, and the ocean is so much deeper. And part of that evolution that we need to have in the world is a stepping back and saying there's something bigger going on here than just thou shalt and thou shalt not. And so I feel, Robert, your question just a moment ago about the Course's relationship with Christianity, I feel very strongly that as what we call post-Christians are pouring out of the church because they disagree with some of the fundamentalist ideology that they find there, the Course is the net that in which they can come to discover a God that is unconditionally loving, and in nowhere in him is any wrath, vengeance, or judgment. I sort of liken it to the Jefferson Bible, where I don't know if you're familiar with this idea, but where it's pretty common, where he cut out everything but he cut out the from the Gospels the words of Jesus and put it in his own Bible, the words from the Bible that he felt were true. And I have a very similar relationship with the Course in Christianity in that sense. The Course is my Jefferson's Bible. It feels like the best of what is true in the faith. And so the Christian language in the Course scares a lot of people, but I also feel that it's very welcoming to those who have left the church, who identify with that language, and it's part of the evolution of Christianity in the world. It's not exclusively that, of course, but I think it is that as
Yes,
well.
beautifully said. So and drawing those together, you're pointing to the fact that as people no longer find a mythic interpretation adequate to their current psychological development, the Course is there with its spiritual practices and a far more expansive, transcendent, embracing, loving worldview.
Yeah, I mean, Christianity is in a real transition now. I mean, there's a full deconstruction movement going on right now to completely deconstruct Christianity as a religion, because it's been harmful to so many. It's been helpful to many as well, but I've already said this, but our belief is that as people are coming out of Christianity, they still retain some connection to the faith. They still retain some connection to spirituality and to Jesus and to God. And the Course is there for those. It's part of the evolution of Christianity and part of the evolution of spiritual tradition overall. I feel like we've made that point, but I'll let me just get us back on track here in terms of a question. You are obviously well versed in the currents of religion and spirituality and the Course's contributions to them, as we've discussed. Are there any elements to the Course's teachings that you find uncomfortable from the standpoint of other paths?
Let's see. Well, I think I would say there are parts of the Course that I find uncomfortable for myself, and I just don't buy into. I think the Course has a very negative view of physical illness, for example, which is very easy to interpret as a kind of blame, that it's some sort of failing. Now it tempers that in various ways, but I think it's easy to get into that. And it seems that the Course also is not clear often on which level it's coming from. For example, with the theme of physical illness, from the perspective of the universal mind, we may be creating everything that happens to us. But from our usual perspective, where most of us live most of the time, or the vast majority of the time, that's a really hard one to get. And the Course kind of slips between perspectives, universal, personal, sometimes without, to my mind anyway, being clear. And I've known a number of people who have just felt it's absolutistic or making these claims that just can't be justified. So those are the two things that come to mind. I'm sure tonight I'll think of others, but those are the ones that pop up. What about you? I'd love to hear.
Oh gosh. You know, I don't really talk a lot about things in the course that sort of make me uncomfortable, especially intellectually, but they're definitely there. I think your point about illness is kind of part of. I have a difficult time with the teachings on illness, the idea that every illness is a manifestation of some kind of unconscious guilt, for instance. And that's part of a view that my mind has a power over my body, my physical environment, a view that I think I turn over in my head on a at least weekly basis. Like, could it really, how could that, and I think there are elements of the course like that. I mean, the course, it's not tame. I don't think any, realized being throughout history has been safe from an ego standpoint. And I just think that there are things in the course where I think, really? And I can't claim to be in some kind of God's eye view place where I can evaluate it, but it just stretches my mind and makes me worry that if I just accept it, I've relinquished my mind, and I've gone over to some kind of true believer place where I don't want to be. So I kind of stay in a middle ground place.
Yeah, that seems wisely said, because first, there are things in the course which just aren't so, as the Bible is. There's a quote there, I can't remember the exact line. I'm sure you can provide it. The Bible says,
know thyself.
No, yes.
Yeah, which it does not say.
Exactly. And I remember bringing that up. One of us brought that up with Bill Thetford, and he said, yeah, the course is a little rusty on its theology.
Well, just to interject, we went through a long process at the Circle of going through Helen's notebooks and producing our new edition. And there are lots and lots of little errors like that. It's not just the Bible, the know thyself quote. There's a lot
that's interesting to know.
Yeah. It's grammatical stuff, it's all kinds of little things, which means you can't accept Helen as some kind of perfect channel. It's just not possible. And there are no perfect channels. So.
Yeah, there are only us human beings. Yeah. That's a very important thing to state, Robin. I'm grateful that you said that, because that helps me, because it is. I think you said something very important about the necessity of working the polarity between, on the one hand, this is coming from a mind so much vaster than this little one that I have to be open to the possibility that what I was saying is true. And on the other hand, it's not always right.
Yeah. But I don't think it has to be right in the details to be a useful and amazing path. So my sort of compromise is, look, I don't know what's what. I'm just running around in a body with some very limited senses. I feel like there's something incredibly true and incredibly transformative here, and I'm gonna have to have it all figured out.
Yeah,
I've got my list somewhere of those things where I'm not so sure about, and fair enough.
I'll just add to that as well. I'm very uncomfortable with the course's teachings on sex. Very uncomfortable with the teachings on illness, as you're saying, Roger. I mean, there is some element of, okay, if any form of sickness comes from something within my own mind, that is unloving, it's very easy to put the blame on the person. Robert likes to say always responsible, but never to blame in
Oh,
terms of
that's nice.
sickness.
Yeah.
Yeah, which I think is a good way to cover it. There's also the teachings around you don't have to side with anyone's misperceptions of you, meaning and that anything that happened in your past doesn't matter in terms of how you deal with the present and move into the future. That's very hard to tell someone who's been through significant amounts of trauma in their life. Sorry, it doesn't matter. And also the idea that all events, past, present, and future, were gently planned for your good. All events.
Yeah.
I mean,
Mhm.
people have horrific events that happen
Yeah.
in their lives,
Yeah.
and so there are uncomfortable teachings in the course. But as I think you're saying, Robert, it doesn't mean that they're not true, and it doesn't mean that we can't stretch to accept them. But I just want to acknowledge also that there are things in there that are difficult for us to take on board fully.
One of
Yeah.
the ones I've really been turning over my head a lot lately, and I know you're familiar with this teaching, Roger, that it's all already happened and we're looking back on it from a standpoint at which it's done. And the more I thought about that, I had some sort of ultimately unworkable way to reconcile that with free will and free choice. And there are places in the early dictation where Personal Guides was given to Helen and Bill, where the author said, I don't know what you're going to choose until you choose it. Okay. I don't know what the people involved in your day are going to do until they do it. And that's the nature of free will. And at the same time, what I finally realized was the way that I had worked out in my mind to reconcile with it's done, it's happened, we're looking back on it. With free will, it didn't work. And I had to rethink the whole thing. And now I'm in this place of thinking, okay, so from the Course's standpoint, both are true. I'm in this moment making novel choices that not even the Holy Spirit can foresee. And I'm at the end of time looking back on something that is done where no changes can be made. And how can both of those things be true at the same time? I just don't understand it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and clearly there are some things that, and of course, that as far I'm quite happy to accept that I just can't understand. Won't, and I'm also hold it all within a context which makes it a little easier. That basically the fundamental nature of reality is bottomless, boundless mystery. That we look deeply enough, we end up in mystery. So I hold that's the context within which I hold the Course and everything else. And I also just want to acknowledge, Emily, the importance of what you said about you just listed some of the things that are uncomfortable for you, and particularly the fact that the horrendous suffering in the world, including kids born in malformed bodies and going through agony and then dying. It's like, this was a choice. Well, maybe from that mind, but is it helpful? Don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Don't know.
Okay, so to move along, and I mentioned this to you in an email, I'm fond of Ken Wilber's, what looks like fairly recent schema. I wasn't hearing this, say, 10 years ago. Maybe it was around, of waking up, growing up, cleaning up, and showing up. And I think he's added another up on there, but I love those four. Waking up, growing up, cleaning up, showing up. What I love about those is they capture something of the necessary breadth of the project we're in. So I just wanted to know if you want to talk about those categories and whether you see them reflected in the Course.
Yeah, sure. Well, they're one more framework, and I think they have the value of being easy mnemonics, pointing, as you said, to separate dimensions of spiritual practice. each of which is essential. And are they part of the course? Absolutely. The first one, waking up, which is basically what the course would call enlightenment or salvation. That's basically training in states of consciousness. And that has been the great contribution of the world's spiritual traditions. A map and technology for inducing profound, transformative, transcendent states of consciousness, similar to or even identical to the ones the great religious founders realized and the great saints and sages have realized. That has been the practical, unique contribution of the world's spiritual traditions, state training. But now we have something new just in the last essentially 50 years in Western psychology. And to my mind, it's quite possibly the most important discovery of Western psychology in the last century. And that is the recognition that psychological growth doesn't have to stop when the body stops growing, that it is possible to develop through subsequent stages of psychological development, each one more comprehensive, more capable of handling greater complexity, capable of greater integration, spread scope of awareness and embrace, and more effective functioning. This is enormously important. And from that perspective, what we've taken to be normality turns out to look more and more like a case of collective developmental arrest. And this is so important for so many reasons. First, it points us to potentials. And the first step in realizing potentials is realizing they're there, and they're available to us. The second thing is it complements the religions, because the religions didn't know anything about post-conventional psychological development. You can't, with states of consciousness, you can recognize them simply by introspection, by looking, oh yeah, boy, do I feel different now. But with stages of development, it's more like a maturation of one's operating system, the fundamental way in which we process our experience. And you don't recognize the process, you recognize the products. So psychological maturation is enormously important. And that's the difference between what we're talking about before, being pre-conventional, mythic, magic ways of looking at the world, for example, or rational scientific modernity, etc., or post-conventional questioning, or some of these more very sophisticated further reaches of psychological development in which people are capable of just comprehending greater complexity, greater subtlety, greater novelty, greater openness to different ways of looking at the world, etc. So when you put those together, and actually the first person, as you're implying, Robert, to do this in any sophisticated way is Ken Wilber with his vast map. And if you, for those really courageous listeners among us, I would recommend the Wilber's book, The Religion of Tomorrow, but it's not for the faint of heart. It's 800 pages. So those two put together create a new understanding of religion and human possibility. Then there's the cleaning up, which is basically purification as it's traditionally known, or purgation in Christianity, or the course's transformation of emotions and motives, etc.
And doesn't Ken, excuse me, doesn't he see cleaning up as having a great deal to do with the shadow that we project onto other people? Am I right about that?
He does, and I think that's a limitation. You're right. For cleaning up, as Ken speaks about it, is primarily what he calls shadow work, working with those unconscious aspects of ourselves which are often projected onto others. But I think that's unfortunate. There's not much I'd argue with Ken about, but that's one thing, because purification or purgation is actually a far larger process, and it involves not just the working with recognizing and transforming unconscious material, we're we are painfully aware of a lot of anger, greed, jealousy, fear, etc. That's really present for us. We don't have to dig into the unconscious for it. That needs transformation too. So purification is a much larger category than shadow work, and I think much more appropriate. So, and then finally, the showing up is the bringing our full selves and transformed selves into the world, and ideally, in the way the Course suggests, as student teachers of the Course's material, or as bodhisattvas, or as Taoism, the immortals, or Jewish Tzaddik, any number of terms just pointing to the idea of embodying a wisdom and then bringing it forth and sharing it in skillful, effective ways.
Yeah, I really like, I mean, that all four of those seem so important, but I like the fact that waking up and growing up are distinguished, because in the spiritual realm, the altered states are so highly prized and valued, and that's how a lot of how we identify spiritual heroes, right? And yet then we often find that those who are adept at the states may not have done some of the growing up that others have done.
Yeah, or the cleaning up, as you implied. And also there's another thing which needs to be distinguished, that is the distinction between altered states and altered traits. Because states are very transient, but the goal is to transform epiphanies into personality, or altered states into altered traits, or as Houston Smith so beautifully said, to transform flashes of illumination into abiding light. Because it's only when these become enduring ways of being that we really can live them consistently. And that's clearly what's important. So I think we need to distinguish between altered states, traits, and stages. All three are very important.
I love the language around flashes of illumination into abiding light, and we are running out of time here, so I'll just cut to another question quickly, and I'm curious as to how you practice the Course, Roger. You mentioned that there's not a day that has gone by over the last 40 years that you haven't had your nose in the book somehow. And so I'm just curious as to what that looks like for you. What is your typical day of practicing the Course like?
Yeah, well, I can be very simple with that. Often, probably for decades, I tried to have my first thought of the day being, I give my life to God to guide today, that lesson. Then as soon as possible after waking up, I spend perhaps half an hour with the Course, reading the lesson for sure, sometimes listening to it on tape. And then during the day, I like those lessons in which it's suggested you take 5 minutes of each hour. I find that a very helpful practice, to use 5 minutes of each hour, and to use those 5 minutes particularly for focusing on the Course. But I should emphasize at this stage, meditation of various kinds has been very important to me, including the Course meditation. So the practice of doing the lesson and meditation have blended pretty much into a unity at this stage. So I sit down and drop into a meditative state, maybe ideally clear awareness, and then just let the thought from the day's lesson rattle around in my mind and work its magic. And then, of course, try with often limited success to apply it to, as the Course says, everything that happens in the day.
It's the hard
That's
part.
great. I mean, those 5 minute per hour ones are a challenge. That's great.
Yeah, and it's nice to hear you say that you like that as part of the practice, that you look forward to that as part of the practice, because so much of what we hear is, this is really tough. 5 minutes in the hour, are you serious? And even with Robert and I, sometimes when the hour comes around, it's like, okay, well, we have to stop. Sometimes we're looking forward to it, sometimes we're not. And so just the idea that it's not a sacrifice, that it's a gift, is something that I think should be more well known in the community.
Yeah, I think as we practice more and more practice and the application of the practice, whether it's through ethics or service, which our culture view as sacrifice, increasingly practice and the expression of becomes not self-sacrifice, but enlightened self-interest.
Yeah. Do we have time for one more question, Emily?
Yeah, one more.
Okay, so I hope you have time for it, Roger.
Yeah, sure.
Where would you like to see the course go in the world? What would you like to see its future be?
Oh, well, I'd like to see it, its thought system spreading through the world increasingly, both overtly and unrecognized. That these ideas become so much a part of us and expressed through our being, as the Course says, you cannot not teach, that the ideas more and more just permeate into the culture and become more of the air we breathe and the thought system in which we inhere, and not necessarily even be recognized as from the Course. For those of us who are drawn to it, wonderful. But in other ways, if we could just get these ideas out into the culture, I think one of the games we're playing as Course students is, what are the ideas that are most strategic to get out into the culture? Now, what Course ideas would just really have a transformative impact? And your lives have been about that, and thank you. So yeah, that's what comes to mind.
Yeah, I think there was guidance that, I mean, Judy was fond of quoting it, that said that it will get out there in forms you won't even recognize.
Beautiful. Yeah.
Well, Roger, thank you so much for
Yes,
giving
thank
us
you.
your time today. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I know I speak for Robert as well when I
Yeah.
say that, and it's a real gift to be able to have this time with you. Thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, me too. What a gift to be able to explore with people who've devoted their lives to this and understand the Course as deeply as you do. And thank you for all the work you've done to get this wonderful material out into the world. And deep gratitude to you both.
Well, we could say the very same thing about you. Thank you for all that you've given the world as well. Bye for now.